right, so I guess we'll get going. So Kate and I are going to talk about sort of cleaning up the licensing info in the kernel. So as you all probably know, the kernel is under GPL version 2 only, at least mostly. But what's been actually found is that there's some variants of, not versions, but different variants of GPL2 present in the kernel source files. Just to be noted that the variants aren't changes in the substantive text, but enough changes. For example, the address for the FSF changed at some point, and that's in some of the license text. And so that can make it really challenging for scanners, which then pick it up as sort of, something different that has to be looked at and takes more time. And then there's also that, the famous sort of note that Linus wrote about the user space API files and needing to kind of identify that more definitively in those particular files. So I think we're going to talk about this more later, but that in order to use the SPDX identifiers, which was sort of the end goal of this, we had to create a new SPDX exception, which is sort of like an additional term to an existing license to accommodate that. And there's some write-ups of some of those differences at those links if you're interested.
Yeah. You can ask, go ahead.
Just curious on the GPL-v2 variants, are you including the GPL-v2 only and or later variants, or is it just the license text?
The variants, those variants that was mentioned there on that last slide were more like changes with the changes in the address, changes in formatting. I think there was,
So
there was also an LGPL switch from lesser to library, although we'd sort of do count those as different
6
licenses.
major variants of the text version.
Yeah. just things that largely don't really matter.
Like I say, when you're working with the scanner, the technology there is to look actually for pattern matching directly. And as soon as you see a variant like that, you're going to think it's something different, or you'll have to invite someone to do it manually, or you'll have to teach it about it in machine learning. And these are the things that have been, quite frankly, defeating. There's more things that are defeating, which we'll go into.
Yeah.
But these are the sorts of things that make it hard to automate. And this is what we're trying to figure out how we can solve.
So then the other, and just going back to the sort of theme of it not just purely being GPL2 only, so we mentioned the user space API files. There's also other code under other licenses in there, or that are as a choice of a license, maybe between GPL2 and something else. And then build tools and I guess, whatever else that might be ambiguous.
Test scripts, images, things like that.
So, well, actually, I should have started this. So the goal was to get, I mentioned before, SPDX identifiers in every source file. So how many people know what SPDX is, or SPDX identifiers? Okay, that's not too bad.
So
the SPDX license list, just to back up a bit, is, so the SPDX stands for the Software Package Data Exchange. It's a project that's been around for
8 years.
I think it's like 9.
Not quite yet.
Not quite, okay. And that is a specification defining fields and ways to communicate information about software packages like the license info, the copyright info, or the provenance, and so forth and so on. And part of that bigger realm is something called the SPDX license list, which is essentially a list of licenses and some other stuff around that, where we've identified a name of the license, a short identifier, so that's the key part, that identifier column in the center there, and then URLs that are constant. So this is at spdx.org license/licenses, and then / and if you just typed in one of those identifiers, it would go to that license. There's about 300 and then 20 sort of exceptions, using exceptions and air quotes because they're not necessarily exceptions in the only GPL sense. And the SPDX license list was basically created when we were starting out with SPDX generally, and the specification, we realized it's much easier to have a short way to refer to licenses that's consistent and reliable, which is kind of a basic concept, but actually a lot harder than it sounds. And so if you think of the license list is sort of not the right word, is sort of a suite of information to go along with that and to make that work, there are also matching guidelines. So if you're going to say, you want to be able to say, this is BSD3 clause, you need some guidance of when is that a match and when isn't it. So BSD3 clause being a great example. Sometimes in the third clause, there's a different name on the, neither this name nor whatever name. So sometimes you'll put the name in there, and that's not a legally substantive change. So you still want to be able to match on that and say it's BSD3. You don't want to have like a different match just because it has a different name in there. So there's that's a great example of the matching guidelines that are defined. And then there's also a license expression syntax, so you can express more complicated license scenarios. So we mentioned in the first slide that some of the files in the kernel may have a disjunctive license choice, right? So it's GPL or BSD3 clause. So, or sometimes you may have more than one license that applies, so it would be an and then with would be used with those exceptions. And then there's also tools to programmatically access the SPDX license list. This is a really important point, especially for developers, because if you go to the website, you'll see that nice little table. And we found that people were, that's a sort of a useful sort of database, if you will, and people were actually scraping the HTML, so don't do that. There are ways to programmatically access it in various ways, thanks to our SPDX tools team. And then the whole thing is pretty actively maintained by the SPDX legal team, which I lead, which it includes both lawyers and non-lawyers as we've gotten more technical in our way to use it. And so the SPDX identifiers can be used in an SPDX document, which is sort of the original goal. And then, but it's handy to refer to licenses in a consistent way in lots of places, one of which is in source files. So this is sort of the bigger project with the kernel is to get, and you'll see examples in it, but there's a URL at the bottom there that has some nice little illustrations and examples of SPDX identifiers being used in source files, which is
the next thing. Yeah, before we go into that, the actual use of identifiers in the source files showed up from the U-Boot community initially. And they came up with the notion of the identifier phrase as a way of separating the information out. And it pretty much got picked up by a bunch of other projects over time and has become a sort of a de facto standard. So we codified it in the spec.
There was actually a developer that predated that had the idea and wrote a blog post about it, but I've never figured out who he or she is.
Okay. But yeah, so the idea came out from the development community, and we basically, the project adopted it, is what it comes down to, just because it's helped simplify things. Because at the end of the day, when people are developing code, it is not always the first thing that some of the developers want to care about. Most of them want to build a software, not time figuring out if they've got their license represented properly, and SPDX identifiers are a short form to basically say this is the license, as opposed to where you're cargo cult copying from, and making sure that you've got a cargo cult copy properly done. In particular, I'll go into the example a little bit later, but the kernel had the license InfiniBand, the open InfiniBand drivers that were started in the kernel. They pretty much were there since the start of the project, open InfiniBand. And the initial person who put the version in basically got 2 clauses from one license and a 3rd clause from a different license and put it there. Okay? Open InfiniBand got it right. They've got the BSD, it's very clear, but whoever put it in the kernel the first time made a mistake on that 3rd clause. And so when the scanners picked this up, because there's a significant key phrase in there, some were getting it wrong, some were getting it right, and because of the pattern matching, it was a bit of a mess, because it wasn't MIT and it wasn't BSD. So as a result of that, and cargo cult copying in the kernel, it was in place, I think it was about 569 times. And we had to pretty much clean it up. So what we ended up doing was creating a license ID. I'll go with that more later. But some of the other things we found, that was the open InfiniBand BSD2 clause. The other example is people are overly terse, rather dismissive of the licensing language. GPL, apostrophe D, which version of GPL? The intent is sort of clear if you're reading it, but if you're a scanner and you're trying to match that and parse that to match it, it becomes really interesting. So those would be basically from the scanning technologies go to 1.0 plus generally, is what people tended to end up defaulting. But you have to basically have manual intervention every time you see that. And then, the kernel community is full of very smart people, and some of them are quite humorous. And the joke that's funny when you write it once the first time, after you've had to deal with extra processing to deal with the therms clause of the GPL, gets old for the scanner, from anyone who's having to do the license clearing on a kernel. When I've been talking to various people about the code base and what their sort of effort they use, I'm usually hearing it's about 80 manual hours to update the licensing and do the clearing for a new kernel version when they move from one kernel version to the next. And that type of burden, quite frankly, is part of why people don't want to update kernels very often. And given all the security changes and things that we're making, getting beyond that is obviously a goal. To give you a bit of a feel for the flavor of the kernel, this was 2.6 in January of 2001. Actually, no, it's 2.4, sorry. And up till now, right, and now we're over, and at that point in time, there was about 15,000 files to drill down to. And now with the current 418, we're about 60,000 files, so it's 4 times the size. And so there's just really no easy way of representing just completely the whole scope of files that we have to be dealing with. And it's a very fast growing project, very fast changing. On average now for about the last year and a half, we're looking between 8 to 9 changes per hour in the kernel going in for each release. And so keeping up with that level of change is a bit of interesting. We've actually had an interesting little peak exercise because of all the removal and the cleanup that's been going on, which is wonderful, removing some of the ancient architectures. But there is a lot of history that's been incorporated, and we need to start looking at moving it forward. So when we start looking at the file level, we initially did some initial work in 316. Because that was from the 316 kernel, because that was what was in Debian Jessie. And we did a full run of Fossology and scan code with the kernel. And we found about 940 licenses on it. Okay, we came back to it with the 413 kernel last year, about this time. And the scan code came up with over 1,000 different license texts. Over 700 of them are variants of the GPL declaration. That's just one declaration, okay? Everyone's fairly familiar, well, most people should be fairly familiar with the standard GPL license header. That's the declaration I'm talking about. There are 700 variants of how people have expressed that in the Linux kernel.
So, I think, and then just again, as a lawyer, it's not about questioning whether it's not necessarily questioning whether it's GPL, it's that by not, the GPL has a standard header in it. The license tells you how to do it. And by not just simply using that exact text and sort of being more creative or terse, as the example we saw earlier, it just creates more work to kind of drill down and see, because if the scanner can hit on an exact match or something that's, consistently identifiable, then, you're kind of done. But if it keeps hitting all these variations, then you got to look at them and go, well, what did they really mean? And so that's a lot of pain.
Yes. And when we were doing this analysis, we found 11,000 files without any license information in them, which is an issue when you're working with the developer certificate of origin, because that you're contributing under the terms of the license in the file. And so we wanted to make sure we could fix that all up. Go ahead.
So for the unmarked files, are those primarily of any given type, like make files or kconfig, or is it just scattered on actual source and headers? And
we did actually classify them by where the gaps are, and it tended to be in certain directories and certain maintainers. But there was also certain classes, and there had been shifting guidance over time. And so the decision that was made was to just basically, if it was bigger than like a 1 or 2 line file, just stick a header in there. So that no one has any ambiguity, and it's pretty mechanical.
I think he was asking where, like, was it primarily any one type of file, I think is what you're
Yeah,
saying?
like
But
I
it
say,
sounds like
like I
it
say,
was across the board.
it was across the board, but there were certain, you could see, yeah. Yeah, the make files were there, but some people like Linus initially put his, the things in the make files. So there was not consistent precedence as to what the best behavior was. There's a lot of folklore in the space. So if we want to go more into some of these details, we're sort of looking at how we can actually summarize this. And using the license list information has been certainly a good part of it. And that was our way of probably getting ourselves to make the situation get better over time as opposed to keep making it get worse. And the copying file has since been changed to actually just reference the identifiers now, which was a bit of a shock when they actually did that. But there are different obligations and that were there in some of the dual files that have been imported from other projects and things like that. And then we had the issue with the Linux user space API, and that needed special handling and resulted in the Linux syscall note being added. So the methodology we were using to try to figure out how to clean this up initially was we took, Wind River produces SPDX documents as outputs for all their projects, and so they generated us one of the SPDX files for their Linux kernel version. We got the same version scanned with scan code. We put it into a great big spreadsheet, and we started doing some matching. And when the two scanners agreed, we just said that was just going to be the license. We weren't going to look at it further. When there was no detectable licensing, we used the license from the copying file. When there was a conflict, it turned to be manual inspection time. And there was a lot of manual inspection. And we also defined some ambiguous cases we are going to have to spend a lot of time looking at later, because it wasn't as mechanical as we would have liked. But this is just sort of a sample. So I personally logged well over 80 hours, and I know Philippe Bombardon did as well. Thomas Gleixner, Greg Crow-Hartman were helping with us, and Steve Winslow, who's one of the lawyers at the Linux Foundation, was also involved in helping us try to figure this out and tease it apart. And so we sort of, we did a fair amount of due diligence to try to get a good picture of what the licensing could be and should be. And now the challenge is to get it cleaned up. And so if at the 4.13 stage in time, bulk of the licenses were the preferred. But in addition to some of that, we found like Artistic, OpenSSL license there, CC0, unlicensed. There's all sorts of interesting little corner cases sitting in there. Most of them are not insignificant places, and to a large extent aren't a big issue. But they just need to be cleaned up, so they stop showing up in these scanners. Or we have it clarified explicitly that yes, this really is it, and it's meant to be. But at total 86 unique licenses can be found in the Linux kernel, at least in the 4.13 timeframe. Hopefully with some of the cleanup that just happened, some of them will be gone, but we'll see. When we looked at 4.13, the top 10 concluded licenses at the file level. It was GPL, which you'd hope to see. And then there was some MIT, and then the Linux syscall note showing up, as well as the BSD. And there was some ISC, there's about 500 ISC files. And as you can sort of see, we've got about 60,000 files sitting here. And that's what the licensing should be based on what's in the source code. We saw missing at those 11,000 I referred to earlier, and they've since been fixed.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you were running the multiple tools on files, did you also look at the module license macro to see if
Yes.
that matched?
Yes, we use that sometimes for a hint as what the license should be for the file. If there was no other evidence, we'd look at the module license. The thing is, it has an interesting definition between GPL meaning GPL v2 only, and then there's some explicit ways of it being expressed. And so there was a bit of confusion initially in some of the analysis there, but we did tease it all apart properly eventually.
I'm assuming then you ran into cases where all three methods conflicted?
Oh yeah, we've got cases where people have one thing in the header and then the notices were different.
License.
And so these are all parts of the things we're going to need to clean up over time.
Is there any kind of precedent on which license then rules the file?
We basically would try to go back to the copyright holder of the file
So
and get
every
a
time you have to go
determination
back and
when we
ask?
could find them. Yeah, more on that. So at the end of the day, the right solution here is to fix it in the source. However, when there's no license, we've got some interesting challenges. Do you want to talk about our syscall?
We kind of already covered this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is, I guess, just reiterating what we said before there. I mean, you know, there was that note that Linus had put at the top of, I guess it was in the copying file.
Yeah.
So, obviously, to identify at the source file level, we needed to have an SPDX identifier for that. So we did that, and that would be used with the with expression. And then,
Go on.
what was the next one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, you probably should have.
Okay, I'll talk about this. Yeah, so last year at the Maintainer Summit, we pretty much, I wasn't in it, but Thomas and Greg talked with the other maintainers and they agreed to add the identifiers. And we also got approval to get all the ones that didn't have identifiers fixed. And so there was a couple of articles that were written up on LWN about it, and we've been sort of moving forward. These are all the licenses that are working with the Linux syscall note because of its working with the GPL family mostly. But these are the different ones we had to basically put it through, and that was the stats from there. And then they agreed at that same maintainer summit what the syntax would be going forward. And one of the more controversial decisions that was made was to put / in front of it for the C code. And this came from Linus and was documented, but at least it was documented. And the rest of it, it's whatever syntax works for people. Based on the language is fine. And we've got to, this is all sitting in the process documentation for the kernel now, as well as, and lines up actually with the Free Software Foundation Europe's reuse guidelines. And we actually had some degree of input into making sure that the reuse guidelines and the kernel were reasonably in sync. So the kernel is following what has been decided by FSFE as a set of guidelines for how to place things and coming up with the concept of preferred licenses and optional. At the end of the day, what we're trying for here is to be able to go grep. Okay? Grep is a wonderful tool. This is all we should really need. We should not need all these sophisticated scanners. We should just be able to say grep, and by each file we should be able to look and see which files are there and then basically figure out how they actually combine into use. That's where we should be spending our mind cycles. Okay? It's a grep goal. That's what we really need. And that's what we're trying to work towards at this point. We've been looking as the dark blue at the bottom is the files with the SPDX identifiers. And we're sort of hovering around 60,000. And what we're trying to do is eventually get that dark blue up to the top. So it's a burn-up chart. We want to get SPDX identifiers in all the files over time. And thanks to Rob for adding a check into check patch to make sure it's there. That we have an identifier. I think it's a warning right now, or is it even turned on?
Check patch is always warnings.
Yeah, okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Are all the maintainers signed on to do this for their subsystems and just taking them a while?
So it's basically maintainer by maintainer and reach out to this. And they've not signed a pledge or anything else, but most of them are in favor of it because it cleans up the code.
But some haven't moved yet, and so I'm just
Some
curious.
haven't moved. Yeah, I've got some slides with the stats on the directory level at least, so you can sort of see roughly where we are. We've got, certain maintainers have gone through and cleaned up their code. We've got public statements of support for doing this from Intel, from ARM, from Samsung. Okay, and who else have we got it from?
It's not really controversial. I mean, there's sort of more on this a little bit later, but as sort of the SPDX license list maintainer for what, since 2010? Is that what we decided? Yeah, I mean, it shocks me the amount of controversy people have created about something as simple as a list of licenses or a way to identify them. I will never understand this, and I don't think there's really anything controversial about just creating clarity, around information for the large part that's already there. Now, I mean, we'll get to, obviously, there's some stuff where it's not clear, and then some conclusion needs to be drawn, or some further sort of forensic needs to be done. That's always the hard part. I mean, as someone who used to do software audits or work for a company who did that, it's always like, it's sort of one of those 80-20 rules or whatever we like to say, where there's like a whole bunch of stuff that's really easy, and then like the last bit, that gets increasingly time consuming. So I don't think there's, it's like Kate was saying, it's a matter of time and effort getting through everything, and that's, steady as she goes.
Yeah, well, we're trying to get there. So right now, we've got, from a grep scan, effectively, we've got 16,000 files of the kernel have got the identifiers in them. We still are missing them in about 45,000 more. I'd say actually it's less than that. It's about 35, because some of them don't need it or shouldn't have it. But we skipped a bunch, about 23 files based on their content. And these are what we're sort of seeing right now. The bulk art is GPL2.0. One of the things to also highlight is the FSF has weighed in that they wanted to use the term only, and there's been a bit of controversy back and forth in the kernel side about when to switch over for that.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the FSF, it's sort of a long story, and I'm not going to go through it all because Stallman wrote a blog post, and you can read a blog post that I wrote on the SPDX website about the release of 3.0, and then it links over. But they really didn't like that GPL-2.0, so the first line has always meant GPL2 only, and that the plus sign was used to indicate or later. It's been like that since the beginning. And it's always great when someone wants massive changes 7 years into a project, but I guess that's a sign of success. And so they just wanted it to be really explicit. And so we changed, pretty unprecedented change really for SPDX. We changed the identifiers to say, just for the GNU family of licenses, dash only or dash or later, just to make it really explicit on which you mean. And so unfortunately, that change on the SPDX side and working with FSF took a little bit longer than the kernel developers were working a little faster on starting to implement this. So they're sort of basic, it's fine, it's not the end of the world. It just means that the identifiers in the kernel are using sort of the 2 point whatever version of the license, I should know that, and the 3.0 version of the license list is where you see the only and or later language. It's not, it's not like
They're
it's
both
not wrong
recognized.
and it's not invalid. It's just, it's like they haven't moved to the new version. So I would guess, I'm speaking on a turn here, so you can, that it's going to be easier to update that once all the work's done, because then
Yeah.
you can update it all at once and with like a replace.
Yeah, I think
but,
there's people who've already created scripts to do this, and they were talking about applying it last release. And the decision was to just let everything stabilize a while in the community and let all the stuff happen and continue working on this, because that's something that's can be done mechanically, which is the advantage, quite frankly, of having this type of regular syntax in place. Yeah.
Does the SPDX notice include the version of the SPDX list? Because you just said.
Yeah, it does. If you find on the website, do you want to go back to that slide? Did you cut and paste
not
it?
not in the notice in the files.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I was
Yeah,
asking.
no,
No.
Okay, so won't you have any problem if the names change for some reason?
we'd endeavor to not change those identifiers. That's always been the goal, so that's why I said it's a pretty big deal to do that. They won't, we're very careful to not ever
Like say,
repeat them, so, it is like a
They're
truly like
deprecated.
find replace in terms of that change, but, yeah.
they haven't been overused. They're deprecated, but they're still recognized. Okay?
Just a
Yeah.
quick question. If the kernel does switch over to GPL2 only identifiers, would you expect GPL2.0 to become non-preferred?
The GPL, well,
The plain
it's
identifier?
the identifier or the license itself.
The plain identifier, not the license. The plain
Yeah.
identifier.
It would mean the same thing, so it would,
Becomes a no-op at that
It-
point?
it's just changing, it's just updating the identifier.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Realistically, we should be able to map that. We should be able to, where's the mouse and cursor? This is effectively 94 lines that should be added effectively to
Right.
that total up at the top. Okay? They're both in there right now, though. And it's, yeah. Okay. And so where things are today is the bulk, we still need to do a lot of work in the documentation area, but some of those things aren't as significant. You can sort of see from Arch, we've got about a third of it done right now. I think the drivers is probably the biggest area to focus on for cleanup.
So wait, does that show identifiers were found in
Yes.
that number of files versus
Yes,
the total? So subtract to see what's like
Percentage.
left to work on, right?
Yes, the percentage. I'll make this look nicer in future presentations, but you've got the raw data here. And about, half of the include files are covered, about a quarter to a third of the file system. And then the other big ones are, I think net needs some cleanup, as the security. So you can sort of see we've made progress in most of the subdirectories of the kernel, but there's still a good ways to go.
Yeah, for me, net is my biggest pain point because all the other subsystems have switched, but net has a lot of ISC licenses, and that's not yet listed in the preferred
Which one?
directory. ISC for net.
ISC, okay, yeah. And so those would be the ones where we'd probably be looking for developers to help reach out to the copyright holders and for the copyright holders to take action to clean it up.
Noted.
Yeah. And like I say, this is not going to get solved overnight, but at least we're moving in the direction of solving it. Okay. And part of the reason for this is obviously to figure out, automation and figuring out who can make the fixes.
Right, so, I don't know, again, I think we're going back and forth, but, just to clarify sort of, what do you do when you have a question as to the license? So just to define that, you might find it's just unclear, like if the reference is conflicting, as you mentioned, or whatever, or it's just sort of unknown, or something that's problematic. It's maybe something that shouldn't be in there, maybe it's not a free license, it's gonna cause, or some other way it's sort of incompatible with the GPL2, and so who can you ask? Which is it's got to be the copyright holders of that file, and then who are they? And so the trick about that is that's not always easy to figure out. So although there may be copyright notices in there, they may not have been updated. It's a lot of years of development, or they just, wasn't added or wasn't updated, or it's changed. Maybe it's original copyright holder and very little of their code is sort of left. Copyright notices are, I think, a subject of a lot of sort of pain and lore or something in the open source world. They're not actually required by law, but they are obviously helpful if they are right. And there are some advantages to having them from a legal standpoint, but it's somewhat of a narrow scenario. But obviously in this case, it's more just about where did this come from? So if we need to clarify something, who can we go ask, right? It's a very pragmatic thing. And
Just
there's,
give a comment here, is if people are trying to look at understand the history of a file and who's actually contributed to it, there's a website that the LF is supporting right now called cregit.linuxsources.org, and all of the files in the kernel, every release, are basically analyzed at the effectively token level and summarized.
Also have some indication that a certain kernel developer in Germany has just gone in and added copyright where it might
Yeah,
not.
there's all sorts of interesting evidence that shows.
So,
Go for it.
so you think?
Is there any plan or thoughts to do an identifier for copyrights? Because we're going through all these files, cleaning.
There's actually a legal syntax for copyrights. It's pretty one line as well.
Well,
So people don't do it.
It doesn't work in the same way because it's usually names, or the copyright holders are the entity, or the person, whether the person's a natural person or an entity. So it's not we can.
And you can have multiple ones and
Right.
based on this other file.
There are other. if you were starting a new project, I think there's other practical ways of handling this. I have my own views on that, but we're not dealing with a new project, right? We're dealing with 26 years of history or whatever. So
Right, but we're going and touching all this header,
yeah, I mean, I think the point here
modifying
is
half of it.
if there isn't any copyright statement, or if you don't have anything to go on without, then surely Git can tell us, and then there's, as I'm sure you guys are well aware, issues with that too, because that just because someone committed something doesn't mean they're the author. So it's just picking this apart. But it goes back to that comment I made before about if there's probably not a totality of 60,000+ files. There's not a ton that have that level of problems that you got to go to the copyright holders. But even if you have a handful or two, I mean it's more than that. It's it's like a forensic exercise.
It's an archaeology. It's effectively software archaeology.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is a great example of don't create this problem going forward, right? I mean, you can't, you can only do so much once something, if you're starting something new, then it should be easy to not recreate these kind of issues. And so hopefully, I would hope anyway, doing all this work and showing these examples. And I know Kate's been on sort of tour talking about this as well as some of the other people who worked on this. It's just like a huge lesson of don't create this problem again. Right?
Please don't, yes.
It's not the best use of time. I mean, it's good in this case, but it's not the best use, we don't want to have to keep doing it over and over. Yeah. It's just like kind of painful.
So, I guess...
Oh, so you wanted me to, whatever, let's see.
Okay, next steps.
So I mean, it's...
Quick question.
Yeah.
Sure.
On the don't create this problem again, do you know what Zephyr's using?
Zephyr's using SPDX identifiers in all the files,
All right.
except for the stuff that comes in as explicit imports into ext, and then it's documented in the subdirectory if they plan on bringing it in from upstream until they can get the upstreams to identify them. And so, yeah, Zephyr's got this right from the get-go, right from the very start, and we started generating an SPDX file using scan code with the last release. And I think there's some room to improve on it, and so I'll be working with the team before we come to our first LTS.
Good to hear, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
How about some meta information so for copyright holder? Because you mentioned that sometimes you want to be able to reach the copyright holder, and as you said, there is not always easy. So it might be interesting to be able to record that as well in files.
Yeah, so I think it's up to the kernel developers if they want to start putting something into their commits to include copyright holder information, so it's logged in the reversion control system. There's a lot of, it's like I say, under Berne Convention, it's as soon as you put it in public media, you've effectively
the signed
included
off by is not always the person who wrote the file as well.
Correct.
That's the other problem, right?
Yeah. And so we've got the signed off, like I say, we've got different mechanisms right now, and they don't necessarily correlate one-to-one with copyright. They correlate with authorship. And so the question is, do we want to put that, distinction in, and is that something that the current, at the end of the day, the project is owned by the developers, and what do the developers want to do?
Sure.
Okay.
So obviously next steps are just continuing the current work in all the files that don't have it yet, and resolving those 500 files that are sort of problematic or have questions on that were skipped initially. And in terms of what other people, how you can help, help update the files. If you have files in there that you've worked on and they haven't been updated yet, you can help with that. If you work for a company that's contributed to the kernel, you can get them to help with that as well at the company level, because then they own the copyright, and publicize it.
Yeah, if you're willing to basically be visible that you're using the identifiers and you're encouraging your developers to use identifiers, get a blog post published somewhere, get it visible somewhere that you are, so that we can point the developers to it, because we keep on getting, questions from various developers coming back saying, is it okay for me to use this? Is my company okay with this? And if we've got something public we can point to, it helps a lot to basically build up confidence that this is a reasonable mechanism going forward. But, Samsung's written a blog post, Intel's written a blog post. I think ARM and Linaro have been very vocal about saying so. So if any company here wants to let us know that we can add their name to this list. I'll happily add it to this list of the slides too. And there's a couple of the blog posts there for your reference. And I guess in summary, the Linux kernel is GPL 2.0, but other licenses do need to be complied with as well. And they do have slightly different terms. Notices files in particular is a bane of my existence. 4.14, as of 4.14, all the files have a license now, so there's no ambiguity for the DCO perspective. And the SPDX identifiers simplify things. And obviously, it's only the copyright holders who should really be updating the licensing in a file. And so I think those are the key things to remember out of this. Anyone have any additional questions? Okay.
Is there some files in the Linux kernel where you have different license applies to different part of the file? So instead of applying to the whole file, only some part?
That would be referred to type as a snippet thing, and mostly because it's a C code, it's not really it's not as obviously detectable. We haven't got anything that's marking as detected as such. It happens when projects have been imported from another place usually, and it's worse than, much, much, much worse in the Java world than we have in the kernel.
How would you deal with that with SPDX? Because I guess...
You basically have to put an AND clause, or you put a comment above the area where you'd found it and put some documentation.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah. Anyone else have any comments, questions? Well, thank you very much for your interest. Appreciate it.